Hello everyone, I'm here to accompany you today. The purpose of this video is to help you fall asleep soundly. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Also write in the comment section, where are you from? And what time are you watching this video? Now, find the most comfortable position and relax. The jungle does not welcome you, it tolerates you, the way a spider tolerates a fly landing on the outer threads of its web. I was 3 days into the Cardamom Mountains, a swath of emerald wilderness straddling the border of Cambodia and Vietnam. The map I had purchased in Phnom Penh from a one-eyed ex-soldier was a crumpled mess of coffee stains and vague contour lines, but it promised something that the satellite images had missed. Prasat Kraham, the Red Temple. My name is Silas. I am an architectural historian, a man who has spent his life studying the bones of dead civilizations. I have walked the halls of Petra and the ziggurats of Ur, but nothing had prepared me for the sheer, suffocating density of this forest. The air here was not oxygen. It was a soup of water vapor, decaying leaves, and insect pheromones. Every breath felt like inhaling through a wet wool blanket. My guide, a local man named Dara, had abandoned me that morning. He didn't ask for more money. He didn't make an excuse. He simply pointed toward a ridge of jagged limestone rising from the mist, shook his head with a look of genuine pity, and turned back. He left me with a machete and a warning I couldn't translate, but the fear in his eyes was a universal language. I pressed on alone. The isolation was immediate. The sounds of the jungle, the screaming cicadas, the whooping gibbons seemed to close in around me, a wall of noise that was paradoxically lonely. By late afternoon, I found it. It didn't look like the majestic ruins of Angkor Wat. There were no soaring towers or wide moats. The Red Temple was a tumor of stone growing out of the side of the mountain. It was built from a dark, reddish sandstone that looked uncomfortably like dried meat, and it was being eaten. The jungle had launched a total assault on the structure. Massive spung trees, the strangler figs, had dropped their roots from the canopy, wrapping around the stone columns like the muscular coils of giant pythons. The roots were pale, almost white, contrasting violently with the dark red stone. They squeezed the masonry, crushing blocks that had stood for 1,000 years. I approached the main entrance. The gateway was a mouth, framed by a lintel carving that had been eroded by time and moss. I traced the carving with my gloved hand. It didn't depict gods or kings. It depicted people, hundreds of them, entangled in vines, their bodies merging with the trees, their faces twisted in expressions of ecstatic agony. I stepped inside. The temperature dropped, but the humidity remained. The interior of the temple was a labyrinth of collapsed corridors and small, cell-like chambers. The air smelled different here. It lacked the earthy rot of the forest floor. Instead, it smelled sharp and acidic, like stomach bile and crushed ants. I decided to set up camp in the central sanctuary. It was the only room with a complete roof, a heavy corbelled vault that blocked out the dying light of the sky. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, but the statue was gone. In its place, a massive root ball from the tree above had punched through the ceiling, hanging down like a uvula in the throat of the room. I laid out my sleeping bag on the stone floor. The stone felt strange. It wasn't cold. It was warm to the touch, retaining a heat that the sun should have lost hours ago. It felt biological. I ate a ration bar, the taste of chocolate and sawdust doing little to settle my stomach. I drank from my canteen, rationing the water. Then I turned off my headlamp to conserve batteries. Darkness in a stone room is absolute. It is a physical weight that presses against your eyes. I tried to sleep, but the temple wouldn't let me. First, it was the sound. A low, rhythmic grinding. It sounded like heavy stones shifting against each other, deep within the walls, but it was too regular to be settling foundations. It had a tempo. It sounded like a slow, heavy heartbeat made of granite. Then came the movement. I was lying on my back, staring up into the black void where the ceiling should be. I felt a vibration in the floor, a subtle ripple that traveled through the stone and into my spine. I sat up, fumbling for my light. "Who's there?" I whispered. The beam of my headlamp cut through the dust. The room appeared empty. The hanging root ball was still there, motionless. The red stone walls were solid, but the corridor I had entered through, was it smaller? I stood up and walked to the doorway. I had walked through it easily with my backpack on a few hours ago. Now, it looked narrower. The stone blocks on either side seemed to have swollen, pushing inward. I shook my head. "Heat expansion," I muttered. "Just heat expansion." I went back to my sleeping bag. I needed rest. I lay down, facing the wall this time. I must have drifted off, because I woke up to a sensation of tightness. Something was holding my leg. I kicked out, thinking it was a snake. My leg didn't move. It was anchored. I snapped my headlamp on, panic flooding my veins with ice-cold adrenaline. I looked down at my legs. The roots, the pale white roots that lined the floor. They had moved. They weren't just lying on the stone anymore. They had lifted up. Thin, hair-like tendrils had grown out of the main root and woven themselves into the fabric of my cargo pants. They were stitching me to the floor. I grabbed my machete. With a frantic slash, I cut the roots. They didn't snap like wood. They severed with a wet, squelching sound. A thick white sap sprayed out from the cut, hitting my skin. It burned. I scrambled backward, wiping the sap off my hand. It stung like acid, leaving a red welt instantly. I looked at the severed root. The end was pulsating. It was retracting, recoiling like a wounded worm. The grinding sound grew louder. The walls were definitely moving now. The room was shrinking. The stone blocks were sliding inward, driven by the massive pressure of the trees outside, or directed by them. I grabbed my pack. I had to get out. I ran toward the doorway. It was gone. The opening had sealed completely. The pale roots had woven a lattice across the archway, a thick, impenetrable web of wood. And behind the roots, the red stone had shifted to block the exit. I was trapped in the stomach. I spun around, scanning the room for another way out. The only opening was the hole in the roof where the main root ball hung. It was 20 feet up. The hanging root ball began to unfurl. It wasn't a root. It was a limb. It descended slowly, the thick woody fibers twisting and stretching. It reached toward me. And then I saw the faces, embedded in the walls of the room, previously hidden by the shadows and the moss, were shapes. I shone my light on them. They weren't carvings. They were bodies. Human forms that had been absorbed into the stone and the wood. A skeletal hand protruding from a sandstone block, the bone fused with the mineral. A face pressing out from the trunk of a strangler fig, the mouth open in a silent scream, the eyes filled with bark. They were the previous explorers, the monks, the looters. The temple hadn't just killed them. It had digested them. It had used their calcium to build its walls, their nitrogen to feed its leaves. The central root touched the floor. It began to snake toward me. It moved with terrifying speed now, thrashing like a blinded cobra. I backed up against the far wall. The stone behind me felt soft, yielding like rot. I swung the machete at the approaching root. The blade bit deep, but the wood was dense and rubbery. The white acid sap sprayed everywhere. It hit my face, burning my cheek. The temple screamed. It wasn't a sound of wind. It was a sound of plumbing, a gurgling, rushing noise from deep underground, as if the earth was swallowing a massive amount of liquid. The floor beneath me began to soften. The stone turned to mud, then to a quicksand-like slurry. I was sinking. The temple was trying to pull me down. I thrashed, kicking my legs. My boots were caught. I unlaced them frantically, my fingers slick with sweat and blood. I yanked my feet free, leaving my boots behind in the sucking floor. I climbed the only thing I could, the massive root system lining the walls. I dug my fingers into the bark. It felt like skin. It was warm and pulsed with a slow rhythm. I hauled myself up, foot by foot, slipping on the moss. The central root lashed out, wrapping around my ankle. The grip was crushing. I felt the bones grind together. It pulled, trying to drag me back down into the soup. I screamed, a raw animal sound. I raised the machete and brought it down on the root wrapped around my ankle. I hacked at it. Once, twice, 3 times. The sap sprayed, blinding me in one eye, but the roots severed. I fell upward, scrambling toward the hole in the roof. I pulled myself through the gap, my chest scraping against the rough masonry. I rolled out onto the roof of the temple. The fresh air hit me. It was still humid, still hot, but it didn't smell of acid. I didn't stop. I ran. I ran barefoot across the roof, jumping from the stone ruins to the branch of a nearby tree. I slid down the trunk, tearing the skin off my palms. I hit the jungle floor and sprinted. I didn't check my compass. I just ran away from the smell of bile. I could hear the temple behind me. The sound of grinding stone and snapping wood echoed through the valley. It sounded like a massive beast gnashing its teeth in frustration. I ran until dawn. I ran until my feet were shredded and bleeding. I was found 2 days later by a border patrol unit. They looked at me with horror. I was covered in white burns, half naked, babbling about the walls having eyes. They took me to a hospital in Ho Chi Minh City. The doctors treated the burns. They said it was a reaction to a toxic sap, something similar to poison ivy but 100 times more potent. But they couldn't explain the infection in my ankle. Where the root had grabbed me, the skin didn't heal. It hardened. It turned gray and rough, like bark. I am back in the States now. I live in a city of concrete and steel, where nothing grows unless it is planted. But the infection is spreading. I can feel it in my bones. My leg is stiff in the mornings. My skin is turning hard. And sometimes when I cut myself shaving, I don't bleed red. I bleed a thick, sticky white fluid that smells of the jungle. I am not just a survivor. I am a seed. And I am terrified of what will happen when I finally stop moving and take root. The concept of nowhere is difficult for the modern mind to grasp. We live in a world of coordinates, grid lines, and constant connectivity. But the Gobi Desert is not a place. It is an erasure. It is 1 million square miles of gravel, scrub brush, and shifting sand dunes that swallow the horizon. I had come to Mongolia seeking clarity, a break from the claustrophobia of the city. I wanted to see the stars without the filter of pollution. I wanted silence. My name is Grant. I rented a rugged Russian-made UAZ Jeep in Dalanzadgad, stocked it with water and fuel, and drove west into the Kongorin Els, the singing sands. The dunes here rise hundreds of feet into the air, massive golden waves frozen in time. I drove for 6 hours into the emptiness. The landscape was hypnotic. Flat, beige gravel stretched out in every direction, broken only by the occasional bleached bone of a camel or a twisted piece of Saxol wood. The sun was a white hole in the sky, hammering down on the metal roof of the Jeep. By late afternoon, the engine began to protest. The temperature gauge spiked. I pulled over to let it cool, stepping out into the heat. The silence hit me first. It wasn't quiet. It was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the sound out of my own breathing. I looked around. There was nothing. No trees, no birds, no movement. Just the curvature of the earth and a sky so big it felt like it was crushing me. I checked the engine. A hose had burst, spraying coolant over the hot block. The sweet, chemical smell evaporated instantly in the dry air. I had water, but I didn't have a spare hose. I was stranded. I wasn't panicked yet. I had a satellite phone. I reached into my pack to retrieve it. The screen was cracked. It must have smashed against the roll bar during the bumpy drive. The display was dead. I stood there, holding the useless piece of plastic, looking at the endless horizon. For the first time, the vastness didn't feel freeing. It felt predatory. There was nowhere to hide. If I shouted, the sound would travel for miles and hit nothing. I decided to wait. Someone would come. A herder. A tour group. I set up a small shade tarp next to the Jeep and waited. The sun began to dip, turning the dunes from gold to blood red. As the light faded, the wind picked up. In the Gobi, the wind doesn't just blow. It vibrates. It whipped across the sharp crests of the dunes, creating a low-frequency hum. This is the phenomenon of the singing sands. The friction of the grains creates a drone that sounds like a cello being bowed by a giant. It started low, a vibration in the ground that traveled up through my boots. Then it grew louder, filling the air with a resonant, mournful note. I sat under the tarp, drinking warm water, listening to the desert play its instrument. Then the note changed. It wasn't just a drone anymore. It modulated. It rose and fell in pitch. It sounded like a voice, a human voice, sustaining a single long syllable. I stood up and scanned the twilight. Hello? The wind swallowed my voice. The drone continued, and then it split. It became two tones, two voices harmonizing. I walked away from the Jeep, toward the nearest dune. The sand was still warm from the day. I climbed the ridge, my feet sinking deep into the loose grains. I reached the top and looked out over the sea of sand. In the valley between the dunes, shadows were lengthening. And in the shadows, I saw movement. It was far away, perhaps half a mile. A figure. It was tall and spindly, walking with a strange, loping gait. It looked like a man on stilts, draped in rags that fluttered violently in the wind. I waved my arms. Over here! Help! The figure stopped. It turned toward me. Even at this distance, I felt the weight of its gaze. It raised an arm. It waved back. But the wave was wrong. The arm moved too fluidly, like a piece of rope snapping in the wind. And it didn't stop. It kept waving back and forth with a frantic mechanical speed. The sound of the wind changed again. The drone sharpened into a chaotic chatter. It sounded like a crowded room, like a radio tuned between stations. Hundreds of voices whispering, arguing, laughing. I scrambled back down the dune to the Jeep. I grabbed my knife and retreated inside the vehicle, locking the doors. The UAZ was a metal box, a tiny fortress in the infinite open. Night fell completely. The temperature plummeted. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, shivering in the driver's seat. The voices outside didn't stop. They got closer. They weren't speaking Mongolian. They weren't speaking English. They were speaking memory. I heard my mother's voice, clear as a bell, calling my name from just outside the passenger window. Grant, dinner is ready. I jumped, hitting my head on the roof. I shone my flashlight out the window. Nothing but sand and darkness. Then I heard my ex-girlfriend, laughing the way she did when she was drunk. You're so serious, Grant. Come outside. The desert was mining my brain. It was taking the sounds I knew and replaying them to lure me out. I squeezed my eyes shut. It's the acoustics, I whispered. Pareidolia. It's just the wind. Someone knocked on the roof of the Jeep. It was a polite, rhythmic knock. I stopped breathing. The Jeep was high off the ground. To knock on the roof, someone would have to be 7 feet tall. Let us in, a voice whispered. It wasn't a specific person this time. It was a dry, raspy voice that sounded like sand pouring over stone. It's so big out here. We are cold. I huddled deeper into the sleeping bag. I refused to look. The Jeep rocked. Something heavy had climbed onto the roof. The metal groaned under the weight. I could hear the suspension creak. I looked up at the ceiling of the Jeep. The thin metal was denting inward. Footsteps. Heavy, cloven footsteps walking across the roof above my head. The voices grew louder, a cacophony of screams and whispers circling the vehicle. They were banging on the sides now. Open the door, Grant. Look at the stars. They are so beautiful. I put my hands over my ears and screamed, "Go away!" The banging stopped instantly. The silence returned, but it was worse. The weight was still on the roof. I could hear it breathing, a slow, wheezing sound, like air escaping a tire. I didn't sleep. I watched the dent in the roof all night, waiting for claws to tear through the metal. When the sun finally rose, painting the desert in soft pastels, the weight lifted. I heard a sound like a heavy sack of flour sliding off the hood. I waited an hour before I dared to open the door. I stepped out. The desert was empty. The dunes were pristine, rippled only by the wind. I looked at the Jeep. The roof was dented, a deep depression in the steel. But it wasn't the roof that chilled my blood. It was the sides of the car. The dust on the windows and the doors was disturbed. There were handprints, hundreds of them. But they weren't human handprints. They were too long. The fingers had too many joints. And they weren't on the outside. They were on the inside of the glass. I stared at them, my mind reeling. The dust was on the outside, but the prints were in the condensation on the inside. Or had they pressed through the glass? No. I looked closer. The prints were on the outside, but they were reversed. As if something had pressed its hand against the glass, but the hand itself was made of negative space, sucking the dust away. I didn't wait to analyze it. I started walking. I walked east, toward where I knew there was a camel farm. I walked for 10 hours in the blistering sun, ignoring the thirst, ignoring the heat. I didn't look at the horizon. I kept my eyes on my boots. I was terrified that if I looked up, I would see that tall, spindly figure waving at me from the next dune. I was rescued by a mining convoy that afternoon. I am back in the city now. I live in a small apartment, a basement unit. People ask me why I don't go out, why I keep the curtains drawn. I tell them I have developed an allergy to the sun. But the truth is, I can't handle the open space. I can't look at the sky, because when I look at the blue expanse, I don't see freedom. I see a mouth, a giant blue mouth waiting to swallow me. And sometimes, when the ventilation in my apartment hums, I hear it. The low cello-like drone of the sand. And underneath it, a whisper. Grant, come back. We are still waving. Taipei is a city of convenience. The traffic lights count down the seconds. The convenience stores are open 24 hours. And the MRT is a marvel of punctuality and cleanliness. It is bright, efficient, and safe. Or at least, that is what I told myself as I swiped my card at the turnstile of the Zhongxiao Dunhua station. My name is Lucas. I was an English teacher working the late shift at a cram school. It was 12:50 a.m. The station was a cavern of white tiles and fluorescent lights, almost deserted. The air conditioning was set to a temperature that felt less like cool and more like morgue preservation. I walked down the escalator to the platform. The digital display board indicated the last train to Dingpu was arriving in 2 minutes. I was the only person on the platform, which stretched out in a long, curving line of glass safety doors. The train arrived. It slid out of the dark tunnel with a rush of displaced air that smelled of ozone and antiseptic. The doors opened with a smooth pneumatic hiss. I stepped inside. The carriage was empty. Not a single soul. Just rows of blue plastic seats facing each other, reflecting the harsh overhead lights. I sat in the middle of the car, placing my bag on the seat next to me. The doors closed. The three-tone chime sounded, a cheerful electronic melody that signaled departure. The train accelerated, the electric hum rising in pitch. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes. I was exhausted. I just wanted to get home to my apartment in Banqiao. It should have been a 20-minute ride. I must have dozed off. I woke up with a start. The train was moving fast, swaying slightly on the tracks. I checked my watch. 1:15 a.m. I frowned. We should have been there by now. I looked at the scrolling LED text above the door. It was usually a stream of station names and news updates. Now, it was just a line of red static, glitching pixels that formed no words, just jagged shapes. I looked out the window. Usually in the underground sections, you can see the tunnel walls, the cables, the occasional service light whizzing by. But the window was pitch black. It wasn't just dark, it was a solid void. There was no reflection of the carriage interior in the glass. It was like looking into an abyss that absorbed the light. I stood up. "Hello?" I called out, walking to the connecting door to the next carriage. I looked through the window into the next car. Empty, and the one beyond that. A long, articulated snake of empty plastic seats and bright lights, hurtling through nothingness. Then the train began to slow down. I grabbed the handrail. We were approaching a station. I looked at the route map above the door. The little green light should have been blinking on Xinpu or Jiangxishui. Instead, a light was blinking on a part of the map that didn't have a name. It was a black sticker placed over the line between two stations. The announcement system crackled to life. Usually the voice is a polite, recorded woman speaking Mandarin, then English. This time the voice was digital, slowed down, and warped. The train came to a halt. The inertia threw me slightly forward. We were at a platform, but it wasn't a normal station. The walls were raw concrete, unfinished and stained with water leaks. The lighting was yellow and dim, flickering with a hum that grated on my nerves. There were no ads, no signs, just bare gray walls. The doors opened. The sound was wrong. Instead of the smooth hiss, it was a grinding metal screech, like a heavy iron gate being forced open. I didn't step out. I stood in the center of the carriage, gripping the pole. On the platform, facing the wall, were people. There were dozens of them. Men in suits, women in dresses, students in uniforms. They were standing in a perfect row, their noses inches from the rough concrete wall. Their backs were to the train. They were perfectly still. No breathing, no shifting weight. "Hey!" I shouted. "Where is this?" No one moved. Then the person closest to the door, a man in a wet raincoat, began to turn. He didn't shuffle his feet. He rotated at the waist. His upper body twisted around while his legs remained facing the wall. He looked at me. His face was a blur. It wasn't that he didn't have features. It was that his features were vibrating. His eyes, nose, and mouth were shifting rapidly, smearing across his skin like a long exposure photograph. He opened his mouth. The sound that came out wasn't a voice. It was the sound of the subway announcement chime, played backward and distorted. Then all of them began to turn. The students, the businessmen, the grandmothers, they all twisted their torsos around, their vibrating faces locking onto me. The air in the carriage grew freezing cold. The lights overhead flickered violently. I slammed my hand onto the closed doors button near the entrance. I mashed it over and over. "Come on, close." The figures on the platform took a step backward, toward the train. They moved in unison, a synchronized hop. They were getting on. The doors hissed. They began to slide shut. The man in the raincoat lunged. He didn't run. He simply fell forward, his body rigid like a plank. His head struck the closing doors just as they sealed. The doors pinched shut on nothing. He hadn't made it in. The train lurched forward. We were moving. I stumbled back to the seat, hyperventilating. We were back in the tunnel. The black void outside the window remained. I checked my watch. 1:15 a.m. It hadn't changed. I looked at the scrolling text above the door. It was clearer now. It was a loop. We were going back to the same station. I needed to break the cycle. I looked around the carriage for anything. An emergency brake, an intercom. I ran to the intercom button on the wall and pressed it. "Help! I'm trapped! The train is going in circles!" Static hissed from the speaker. Then the driver's voice answered. But it wasn't the driver. It was my own voice, recorded from 10 seconds ago. "Help! I'm trapped! The train is going in circles!" The train began to slow down again. We were arriving. I couldn't handle those faces again. I couldn't handle the vibrating blur. I looked at the reflection in the window. The glass was black, but in the reflection, the carriage wasn't empty. In the reflection, the seats were full. Sitting next to me in the glass was the man in the raincoat. Sitting across from me was the student. They were all there, sitting quietly, staring at me in the reflection. I turned my head to look at the real seats. Empty. I looked back at the reflection. The man in the raincoat smiled. His vibrating face stabilized for a second. He raised a finger to his lips. The train stopped. The doors groaned open. I squeezed my eyes shut. I curled into a ball on the floor, covering my ears. I refused to look at the platform. I refused to acknowledge the sound of feet hopping onto the train. I felt the cold press against me. I felt the crowd. The carriage, which was empty to my eyes, was full to my senses. I could smell the wet raincoats. I could feel the static of their nylon clothes. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. Then a voice broke through. "Sir? Sir, are you okay?" It was a normal voice, a human voice. I opened my eyes. A cleaner in a yellow vest was standing over me, holding a mop. The carriage was bright. The scrolling text read Banqiao Station Terminal. The doors were open. Outside, I saw the familiar tiled walls of my home station. I saw a vending machine. I saw a tired businessman checking his phone. "Sir, this is the last stop," the cleaner said, looking concerned. "You have to get off." I scrambled up, grabbing my bag. I didn't look back. I ran out of the station, through the turnstiles, and up to the street level. The humid night air of Taipei hit me. The streetlights were orange and warm. Cars were driving by. I checked my watch. 5:30 a.m. I had boarded at 12:50 a.m. The ride takes 20 minutes. I had been on that train for over 4 hours. I walked home, trembling. I threw my clothes in the trash. I showered for an hour. I don't take the MRT anymore. I take the bus, or I walk. But sometimes, when I'm walking past a subway entrance, I can feel the draft of cold air rushing up from the underground. And in that draft, I hear it. Not the sound of trains, but the sound of a distorted chime and the rhythmic thud of 100 people hopping in unison, waiting for the doors to open again. The air at 17,000 feet does not sustain human life. It barely tolerates it. Every breath is a negotiation with the atmosphere, a desperate gasp for oxygen that isn't there. My lungs burned with a cold fire, and my head throbbed with the dull, rhythmic ache of altitude sickness. I was standing on a ridge of jagged black shale, looking down at the Sangpo Monastery. My name is Elias. I am a linguistic anthropologist, a collector of dying languages and forgotten prayers. I had spent 2 weeks trekking through the forbidden zones of the Tibetan Plateau, bribing border guards and navigating by stars to find this place. The legend spoke of Sangpo not as a place of enlightenment, but as a prison, a fortress built to keep something in, rather than to keep the world out. The monastery hung from the cliff face like a hornet's nest made of stone and dark wood. It was an architectural impossibility, suspended over a drop that vanished into the mist miles below. There were no lights, no smoke from cooking fires, just the silent, brooding structure silhouetted against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. I descended the narrow goat path, my boots slipping on the loose scree. The wind here was a physical assault. It stripped the heat from my body instantly, cutting through my down parka as if it were paper. But it was the sound of the wind that unnerved me. It didn't howl. It whistled, a high, discordant note that sounded like a flute made of bone. I reached the heavy wooden gates. They were unbarred. I pushed them open, the ancient iron hinges screaming in protest against the silence. The courtyard was empty. In the center stood a stupa, a Buddhist shrine, but it was wrong. Traditional stupas are white, symbolizing purity. This one was black, built from obsidian, and covered in carvings that made my eyes water to look at. They weren't geometric patterns. They were organic, twisting shapes that looked like intestines or worms. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded flat, the thin air swallowing the sound instantly. A figure emerged from the shadows of the main prayer hall. He was a monk, wrapped in robes of deep crimson that looked black in the dim light. He wore a heavy wool mask over the lower half of his face, obscuring his mouth. He did not speak. He did not bow. He simply turned and gestured for me to follow. We walked through corridors that smelled of rancid yak butter and old stone. The cold inside was damp and penetrating. The monk led me to a small cell cut into the rock. It contained a sleeping mat and a single butter lamp flickering weakly. He turned to leave, but then he stopped. He pointed to his own ears, then to the heavy wooden shutters on the cell's single window. He closed his hands into fists and pressed them against the sides of his head. The message was clear: do not listen. He left, closing the heavy door. The latch clicked into place. I was alone. I sat on the mat, trying to regulate my breathing. The hypoxia was setting in. The edges of my vision were blurring. I drank from my canteen, the water freezing cold, and waited. Night fell with a sudden, crushing weight. I tried to sleep, but the atmosphere of the place made it impossible. The silence was too loud. It was a pressure that built up in the ears. Then, around midnight, the vibration started. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a tremor in the stone floor. I felt it in my teeth. A low, resonant frequency that seemed to rise from the bowels of the mountain. Then came the chanting. I had heard Tibetan throat singing before, the Gyuto monks who can produce 3 notes simultaneously. It is a beautiful, deep sound. This was not beautiful. It was a guttural, grinding noise, deeper than a human throat should be capable of producing. It sounded like tectonic plates shifting against each other, and there were hundreds of voices. The syllable was distorted, twisted into a dissonant chord that made my stomach turn. I remembered the monk's warning, do not listen. But I am a scientist. I came here to record this. I reached into my pack and pulled out my digital recorder. I crept to the door. It was locked from the outside. I went to the window. The shutters were thick wood, bolted shut. I found a knot in the wood, a small imperfection. I pulled out my pocket knife and gently worked at it, popping the piece of dry wood out. A beam of pale moonlight pierced the darkness of my cell. I put my eye to the hole. My cell overlooked the main courtyard, the one with the black stupa. Below me, the monks had gathered. There were at least 50 of them, arranged in a perfect circle around the obsidian shrine. They were all wearing the heavy wool masks. They were swaying in unison, their bodies jerking rhythmically to the sound of the impossible chanting. The vibration grew stronger. The butter lamp in my room rattled on the floor. Then, the monks removed their masks. I gasped, pulling back from the peephole for a second. I forced myself to look again. They had no mouths. Where the lips and teeth should have been, there was only smooth, scarred skin. The skin had been sewn shut, healed over decades ago. Yet the chanting was coming from them, or rather, through them. Their throats were bulging and convulsing, acting as vessels for a sound that originated elsewhere. They were not chanting to the stupa. They were singing to open it. The black obsidian structure began to glow, not with light, but with darkness. A purple, ultraviolet haze seeped from the cracks in the stone. The air in the courtyard began to distort. The wind died. The cold intensified. Something was rising from the stupa. It looked like a column of smoke, but it moved with intelligence. It swirled and coalesced, forming a shape that defied geometry. It was a tangle of limbs, or perhaps shadows of limbs, shifting and reforming constantly. The chanting reached a fever pitch. The sound was deafening now, a physical force that rattled the bones in my chest. The entity in the center of the circle expanded. It towered over the monks. Then it fed. It didn't eat flesh. It ate the sound. I watched in horror as the visible waves of the chanting were sucked into the vortex of the shadow. The monks were pouring their life force, their vibration, into this thing. As the sound left them, they withered. Their skin turned gray. Their bodies slumped. The entity grew more solid. I could see eyes opening in the smoke. Dozens of eyes, burning with a cold, pale light. One of the monks, a young man near the front, collapsed. His connection to the chant broke. The rhythm faltered. The entity lashed out. A tendril of shadow whipped across the circle. It struck the fallen monk. There was no blood. The monk simply ceased to exist. He didn't turn to dust. He vanished, leaving only his crimson robes crumpling to the cold stone. I stepped back from the peephole, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I bumped into the small wooden table behind me. The sound was tiny, insignificant, but the chanting stopped instantly. The silence that followed was violent. It hit the courtyard like a thunderclap. I froze. I held my breath until my lungs burned. I leaned forward and looked through the hole one last time. The courtyard was motionless. The entity had dissipated back into the stupa. But the monks, 50 heads were turned upward. 50 pairs of eyes were staring directly at my window. They couldn't speak. They had no mouths. But I heard their voice in my head. It was a collective thought, a telepathic scream of rage. The listener. The heavy wooden door of my cell shook. Someone was on the other side. The latch lifted. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack and slammed my weight against the shutters. The old wood splintered. I kicked them open. The wind howled, inviting me into the abyss. I climbed onto the window ledge. The drop was terrifying. 100 feet to a lower terrace of rock. I heard the door behind me crash open. I jumped. I hit the snow-covered ledge below with a bone-shattering impact. I rolled, absorbing the force, but I felt something snap in my ankle. I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the agony. I limped toward the edge of the cliff, toward the goat path. I could hear them behind me, the soft slap of bare feet on stone. They were coming. I descended the mountain in the dark, sliding down scree slopes, tearing my hands on thorns. I ran until the sun rose, painting the Himalayas in indifferent gold. I didn't stop until I reached the first village 3 days later. I lost 3 toes to frostbite. My ankle will never heal correctly, but the worst damage isn't physical. I am back in the city now. I live in a soundproof apartment. I wear noise-canceling headphones 24 hours a day, because I can still hear it. It's a low, grinding vibration in the base of my skull. It gets louder when it's quiet, and sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see the skin around my mouth tightening. It feels like scar tissue forming. It feels like my lips are trying to fuse together. I know they are still chanting up there, and I know that one day the song will finish, and when it does, the silence will come for the rest of us. The water in Kerala does not flow, it breathes. It is a vast, interconnected respiratory system of lakes, lagoons, and canals that inhale the tide from the Arabian Sea and exhale the murky, stagnant water of the interior. I had come to Aleppi to experience the romance of the backwaters. I rented a ketuvalam, a traditional houseboat made of jackwood and coir knots, with a thatched roof of woven palm leaves. It was a floating cottage, designed for leisure, drifting aimlessly through the emerald corridors of God's own country. My name is Caleb. I was traveling alone, seeking the kind of silence you can't find in the cities of the West. My captain was a man named Nair. He was small, wiry, and possessed a silence that matched the landscape. He steered the boat with a long bamboo pole, standing at the prow like a statue carved from mahogany. The afternoon was idyllic. We drifted past paddy fields and small villages where women washed clothes on stone steps. But as the sun began to set, turning the water into a sheet of hammered copper, Nair turned the boat. We left the wide, open expanse of Vambanad Lake and entered a narrow canal. "Shortcut," Nair said. It was the first word he had spoken in 4 hours. The canal was tight. The vegetation on the banks changed from swaying coconut palms to dense, knotted mangroves. The roots of the trees arched out of the mud like the arthritic fingers of buried giants, grasping at the water. The canopy overhead thickened, blotting out the twilight sky, plunging us into a premature gloom. The air grew heavy. It was a physical weight, saturated with moisture and the smell of wet earth, rotting vegetation, and something sharper, sulfur perhaps, or stagnant mud. The humidity was absolute. My shirt clung to my skin like a second layer of flesh. We moved deeper. The canal narrowed until the bamboo poles of the boat brushed against the leaves on the banks. The sound of the friction was loud in the silence. Then the boat stopped. It didn't hit land. It simply ceased to move forward. The momentum died, absorbed by the thick green carpet of water hyacinths that choked the surface of the canal. These invasive weeds formed a floating island, trapping us in a vise of vegetation. I walked to the front of the boat. "Nair, are we stuck?" Nair was standing at the prow, holding the bamboo pole. He wasn't pushing. He was staring straight ahead into the wall of mangroves. "We wait," he said softly. "Wait for what? The tide?" He didn't answer. He slowly sat down on the wooden deck, cross-legged, and closed his eyes. Night fell completely. The darkness in the mangroves is not black. It is a deep, suffocating green. The only light came from the single kerosene lamp hanging from the roof of the houseboat, casting a swaying, sickly yellow circle of illumination. I sat in the wicker chair on the deck, swatting at mosquitoes. The silence was unnerving. Usually the backwaters are full of sound, crickets, frogs, the splash of fish. But here, there was nothing. The water was dead calm. The insects were silent. Then, I heard the dripping. It came from the darkness of the mangroves to my left. It sounded like heavy drops of liquid falling from a height into the water. I shined my flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the humid air, illuminating the twisted roots of the mangroves. Hanging from a branch, about 6 feet above the water, was a shape. It looked like a large fruit, wrapped in vines. But as the light steadied, I realized it wasn't fruit. It was a bundle. Cloth, stained dark with mud and algae, wrapped tightly around something roughly the size of a torso. Water, or something darker, was leaking from the bottom of the bundle, dripping into the canal. I stood up, my heart quickening. "Nair, look at that." Nair didn't open his eyes. "Offerings," he whispered. "Offerings to what?" "To the Yakshi." I knew the folklore. The Yakshi is a vampire spirit of the trees, a beautiful woman who seduces men and drinks their blood. It was a story to scare children. "We need to turn back," I said, my voice rising. "Push the boat out." Nair turned his head slowly to look at me. In the yellow light of the lamp, his eyes looked milky, clouded over with cataracts I hadn't noticed before. "The water is holding us," he said. "The water wants a passenger." The boat lurched. It wasn't a wave. Something had struck the hull from beneath. A heavy, solid thud that vibrated through the wooden planks of the deck. I grabbed the railing. What was that? Another thud, this time from the right side. I looked over the rail. The surface of the water was covered in the thick mat of hyacinth weeds. But the weeds were moving. They were undulating, rippling as if something large was swimming just beneath the surface, tracing the perimeter of the boat. I saw a hand. It broke the surface of the weeds for just a second. It was pale, bloated and blue. It grasped a handful of the green plants and pulled them down. I stumbled back. "There's someone in the water." Nair stood up. He picked up the long bamboo pole. "Help them!" I shouted. Nair walked past me. He didn't go to the rail. He went to the kerosene lamp. He blew it out. The darkness was instant and total. "Nair!" I screamed. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking the button frantically. The beam flared to life. I swung it around. Nair was gone. The deck was empty. There was no splash, no sound of footsteps. He had simply vanished into the dark. I was alone on the boat. The thumping against the hull grew faster. It sounded like dozens of fists hammering on the wood from below. The boat began to tilt. They were climbing. I heard the sound of wet bodies dragging themselves over the wooden gunnels, the squelch of mud against timber, the dripping of water onto the deck. I retreated into the cabin, slamming the wicker door and locking it. It was a flimsy barrier. I shone my light through the gaps in the woven wall. On the deck, shadows were moving. They were hunched, misshapen forms, dripping with sludge. They moved with a jerky, aquatic coordination. They weren't walking. They were slithering, pulling themselves forward with long, pale arms. One of them stopped in front of the door. I saw its face in the sliver of light. It wasn't a monster. It was a man. Or it had been. His skin was the color of a drowned corpse, bloated and peeling. His eyes were gone, eaten away by the fish, leaving empty sockets filled with black mud. But around his neck, he wore a small gold chain. A tourist, just like me. He raised a hand and scratched at the wicker door. It was a gentle, inquiring sound. Then he spoke, but the voice didn't come from his throat, which was choked with weeds. It came from the water outside, a bubbling, gurgling sound that surrounded the boat. The boat groaned. The weight of the things on the deck was pushing it down. Water began to seep through the floorboards of the cabin. It was cold, smelling of rot and ancient silt. I scrambled up onto the bed, the highest point in the room. The wicker door began to bow inward. The wood snapped. I looked around for a weapon. There was nothing. Just a decorative vase and the pillows. The water rose. It was ankle deep in the cabin now. Then silence. The scratching stopped. The thumping ceased. The boat settled, listing heavily to the left. I waited. I held the flashlight like a sword. From the darkness of the ceiling, something dripped onto my hand. I looked up. The thatched roof of the houseboat was teeming. They hadn't come through the door. They had climbed the sides and torn through the palm leaves above. Looking down at me, hanging from the rafters like bats, were faces. Pale, wet, eyeless faces. Dozens of them. Nair was there, in the center. He was hanging upside down, his legs wrapped around a beam. His eyes were no longer milky. They were black voids. He was smiling, his teeth stained with mud. He reached down. His hand was holding the bamboo pole. He didn't strike me. He offered it to me. "Push," he whispered. "Push us down." The flashlight flickered and died. I screamed, but the sound was cut short by the rush of cold, brackish water as the roof gave way, and the weight of the dead collapsed on top of me. I woke up in the morning, drifting in the main channel of Vembanad Lake. A fisherman found me. I was lying on the wreckage of the houseboat's roof, shivering, covered in mud and water hyacinths. The police said the boat had hit a submerged log and capsized. They said Nair, the captain, had drowned trying to save the vessel. They never found his body. They said I was lucky, but I know the truth. I didn't escape. They let me go. I am the messenger. When I look in the mirror now, I see it. A faint, green tint to my skin. And I am always thirsty. No matter how much I drink, my throat feels dry, like it is packed with dust. And at night, when I lie in my bed in New York, I can hear it. The sound of dripping water, and the smell of the swamp fills my room, heavy and suffocating. I know they are waiting. The roots are long and the water is patient. Eventually the tide will come in, even here. The Karak Highway is a serpent of asphalt carved into the spine of the Malay Peninsula. By day, it is a breathtaking drive through ancient rainforests and limestone cliffs. But at night, the jungle reclaims the road. The streetlights are sparse, casting pools of sickly orange light that fail to penetrate the towering walls of trees on either side. The humidity rises, bringing with it a fog that smells of wet earth and unburnt diesel. My name is Ryan. I was a logistics consultant, driving a rental sedan from Kuantan back to Kuala Lumpur. It was 2:00 a.m. I was exhausted, fighting the hypnosis of the white lines flashing past my headlights. The radio had long since dissolved into static, leaving me with only the drone of the engine and the drumming of a sudden tropical downpour on the roof. I was approaching the Genting Sempa Tunnel, the highest point of the pass. The rain was torrential, turning the road into a black mirror. That was when I saw it. Ahead of me, in the slow lane, was a car. It was a Volkswagen Beetle, an old model from the 60s. It was painted a dull, dirty yellow that seemed to absorb my headlights rather than reflect them. It was moving painfully slowly, perhaps 20 miles an hour. I checked my mirrors. The highway was empty behind me. I signaled right and pulled into the fast lane to overtake. As I pulled alongside the Beetle, I glanced over. I expected to see an old man gripping the wheel, or perhaps a breakdown. The windows of the Beetle were dark, tinted to an illegal opacity. I couldn't see the driver. I couldn't see inside at all. I accelerated past it, eager to put the slow vehicle behind me. I watched it shrink in my rear-view mirror until its dim yellow taillights vanished into the rain and fog. I relaxed slightly. Just an old car, just a slow driver. 10 minutes passed. The road wound through a series of sharp S-bends. I maintained a steady speed. Then, I rounded a curve. There was a car ahead of me in the slow lane. It was a yellow Volkswagen Beetle. I frowned. It must be another one. A club of vintage enthusiasts driving in a convoy. I signaled and overtook it again. Same dull paint. Same dark windows. Same slow mechanical crawl. I looked at the license plate this time. It was mud-spattered, illegible, except for the first letter, W. I sped up, putting distance between us. My heart rate climbed a notch. 5 minutes later, the yellow Volkswagen was ahead of me. This was impossible. I hadn't stopped. I hadn't slowed down. There were no exits on this stretch of the highway. There was no way it could have passed me. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. Wake up, I whispered to myself. You are tired. You are hallucinating. I didn't overtake it this time. I stayed behind it, keeping a safe distance. The Volkswagen began to slow down. It dropped from 20 miles an hour to 10, then 5. It came to a complete stop in the middle of the driving lane. I slammed on my brakes, skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. My car came to a halt 20 feet behind it. We sat there in the dark. The rain hammered against the metal skins of our vehicles. The Volkswagen's engine was silent. No exhaust fumes came from its tailpipe. It sat there like a boulder. I flashed my high beams. Move! I shouted inside my closed cabin. The Volkswagen didn't move, but the road did. I felt a vibration through the floor of my car. It wasn't the engine. It was coming from beneath the tires. I looked at the asphalt between my car and the Volkswagen. The road surface was bubbling. The black tarmac, which should have been solid stone and bitumen, was rippling like boiling tar. It looked viscous, soft. Then the Volkswagen began to sink. It didn't sink like a car driving into water. It sank like a heavy object placed on a sponge. The tires disappeared into the road. Then the bumper. The asphalt rose up to meet it, stretching and pulling like black chewing gum. I watched in horror as the road swallowed the rear wheels of the yellow car. And then, the trunk of the Volkswagen popped open. It didn't open with a mechanical click. It tore open, the metal bending as if pushed from the inside. Something climbed out of the car. It wasn't a person. It was a mass of dark, wet material that looked exactly like the asphalt itself. It was a humanoid shape formed from road tar and gravel. It had no face, just a rough, pebbled surface where a head should be. It slid off the back of the sinking Volkswagen and stood on the road. It turned toward me. It raised a hand, a heavy, dripping lump of tar, and pointed at the ground beneath my car. I slammed my car into reverse. The tires spun, screaming for traction on the wet road, but the car didn't move. The rear tires were stuck. I looked in the rearview mirror. The asphalt behind me was rising. It had formed tendrils, thick black ropes of road material that were wrapping around my rear axle. The road was holding me. The figure made of tar began to walk toward me. Its footsteps were heavy and wet. Slap, squelch, slap. It walked past the sinking Volkswagen, which was now buried up to its windows in the road. I locked my doors. I scrambled into the passenger seat, trying to get away from the driver's side where the creature was approaching. The creature stopped at my window. It pressed a hand against the glass. The glass didn't break. It began to melt. The heat radiating from the creature was intense, the smell of fresh, scorching asphalt being laid on a hot day. The safety glass turned to liquid and dripped onto the dashboard. The creature reached in. It didn't grab me. It touched the steering wheel. The leather of the wheel hissed and dissolved. The creature's hand merged with the dashboard. It was fusing with the car. I realized then what the Volkswagen was. It wasn't a car. It was a shell. A lure used by a predator that lived in the infrastructure. An anglerfish of the highway, using a bright yellow shape to catch tired drivers in the dark. The road beneath my car gave way completely. The sensation was terrifying. The car tilted backward, the nose pointing up at the rain-swept sky. We were sinking into the highway. I scrambled for the passenger door handle. It was jammed. The metal frame of the car was warping, crushed by the pressure of the semi-liquid road. I kicked the window. Once, twice. The glass shattered. I crawled out, tumbling onto the wet asphalt of the passing lane. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I ran toward the jungle, away from the cars. I looked back. My rental car was half gone. It looked like it was being digested. The asphalt rippled around it, bubbling and popping. The tar creature had dissolved back into the mass, pulling the vehicle down with it. The yellow Volkswagen was gone completely. The road where it had been was smooth and black, pristine, as if nothing had ever happened. But the road wasn't finished. I stood on the shoulder, near the guardrail. The ground beneath my boots felt soft, spongy. I looked down. The white line painted on the edge of the road was moving. It was slithering like a white snake, coiling around my boot. I kicked it off and vaulted over the guardrail, tumbling down the steep embankment into the jungle. I slid 50 feet down through the mud and ferns, stopping only when I hit the trunk of a rubber tree. I lay there in the mud, gasping for air, listening to the rain. Above me, on the highway, I heard a sound. It was the sound of an engine approaching. I looked up through the trees. I could see the beams of headlights cutting through the fog. A car drove past slowly. It was a yellow Volkswagen Beetle. It moved with a smooth, silent grace. It drove over the spot where my car had been swallowed. It didn't stop. It continued down the winding road, its taillights glowing like red eyes in the dark. It was resetting the trap. I spent the night in the jungle, shivering, too terrified to step back onto the pavement. I walked 10 miles through the undergrowth the next morning until I reached a village. I told the police my car had been stolen. I didn't tell them the road ate it, but I can't escape it. I live in the city now. I walk everywhere. I stay on the concrete sidewalks. But sometimes, on hot days, when the sun beats down on the asphalt and the tar begins to soften, I smell it. That thick, chemical smell. And I see the ground ripple. And I know that beneath the surface of every road, beneath the skin of the city, the thing is moving. It is swimming through the streets, waiting for a driver to slow down, waiting to flash those yellow headlights in the rearview mirror. Bangkok is a city that breathes water and exhales concrete. It is a sprawling, humid organism of neon lights, street food smoke, and traffic that flows like viscous lava through the arteries of the metropolis. But rising above the chaotic skyline of the Sathon district stands a dead limb. The Sathorn Unique Tower, a 49-story luxury condominium complex that was abandoned during the financial crash of '97, left to rot before it was ever finished. My name is Alex. I am an urban explorer, a climber of forgotten heights. I had come to Thailand specifically for this building. The locals call it the Ghost Tower. They say it casts a shadow over the city's fortune. I didn't care about superstition. I cared about the view from the roof, the solitude of the summit. I arrived at the base of the tower just as the sun began to set, turning the polluted sky into a haze of bruised purple. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of river mud and exhaust fumes. I bribed the squatter guarding the fence with a 1,000 baht note. He took the money without looking at me, his eyes fixed on the dark, gaping maw of the building's entrance. He unlocked the padlock with a rusted key and stepped aside. I entered the lobby. It was a cavern of raw concrete and exposed rebar. Puddles of stagnant water covered the floor, breeding armies of mosquitoes that whined in the humid air. The escalators stood frozen, stripped of their mechanics, looking like the ribs of a prehistoric beast. I found the central stairwell. It was a narrow concrete throat spiraling up into the darkness. There were no railings, just a sheer drop down the center shaft that went all the way to the basement. I began the climb. The first 10 floors were routine. The noise of the city outside was still audible. The distant hum of tuk-tuks, the sirens, the boats on the Chao Phraya River. The walls of the stairwell were covered in the usual graffiti, tags, names, crude drawings of anatomy, the standard markings of teenagers and tourists. By the 20th floor, the city noise began to fade. The air grew cooler, but also staler. It smelled of wet dust and pigeon droppings. My legs burned with the exertion, the repetitive motion of stepping up, up, creating a hypnotic rhythm. I shone my flashlight on the walls. The graffiti here was different. It was less chaotic, more deliberate. There were sentences written in black spray paint. Don't look down. It gets tighter. The concrete is thirsty. I ignored them. Urban legends are part of the territory. I reached the 30th floor. I stepped out onto a balcony to catch my breath. The view was staggering. Bangkok spread out below me like a circuit board of gold and orange light. The wind whipped through the open structure, howling through the empty elevator shafts with a mournful, flute-like sound. I went back to the stairs. The 31st floor, the 32nd. The graffiti changed again. It wasn't spray paint anymore. It looked like it had been scratched into the concrete with something sharp, or perhaps painted with a dark, thick liquid that had dried to a rusty brown. And the messages were personal. Tired, Alex? I stopped. I stared at the wall. The letters were jagged, frantic. I shone my light around. Is anyone there? I shouted. My voice echoed up the shaft, bouncing off the hard surfaces, distorting until it sounded like a laugh. I kept climbing, faster now. I wanted to reach the roof. I wanted to be in the open air. 35, 36. Alex is alone. No one knows you are here. Gravity is patient. My heart hammered against my ribs. I checked my phone. No signal. The concrete core of the building was blocking the network. I reached the 40th floor. I climbed the next flight of stairs. I counted the steps. 20 steps. Turn. 20 steps. I looked at the number painted on the wall of the landing. 40. I frowned. I must have misread the previous floor. I climbed another flight. 40. I stopped. The paint was fresh. Wet. It glistened in the beam of my flashlight. I ran up the next flight, taking the steps 2 at a time. 40. The stairwell had become a loop, a vertical treadmill. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. I turned around. I would go down. If I couldn't go up, I would leave. I ran down the stairs. Down, down, down. I reached the landing below. 40. I was trapped. I looked at the graffiti on the wall. It was moving. I don't mean it was being written by an invisible hand. I mean the paint itself was crawling. The black lines were shifting, sliding across the concrete like colony insects. The letters dissolved and reformed into new words. Stay. Become part of the structure. We need mortar. I backed away from the wall, pressing myself against the non-existent railing of the center shaft. I looked down. The shaft didn't end in darkness. It ended in a faint red glow miles below, and the shaft wasn't straight. It was pulsing. The walls of the stairwell were breathing, expanding and contracting with a microscopic tremor that I could feel through the soles of my boots. The building wasn't dead. It was dormant, and I had woken it up. I heard a sound from the stairs above me. Something was coming down. It sounded like heavy concrete blocks being dragged over the steps, but it had a wet, slapping undertone. I shone my light up the stairs. A figure was descending. It looked like a man, but he was made of debris. His skin was gray cement, cracked and peeling. Rebar protruded from his shoulders and elbows, rusted metal spikes tearing through the concrete flesh. His face was a mask of wet mortar, featureless except for a gaping hole where a mouth should be. He was dragging his left leg, which was just a lump of concrete fused with a steel girder. He stopped on the landing above me. He turned his head. The wet mortar of his face rippled. The voice was the sound of grinding stone. I didn't think. I reacted. I ran. Not up or down the stairs, but out. I sprinted through the open doorway of the landing, into the unfinished hallway of the 40th floor. The floor was a mess of debris, holes and pools of water. I ran toward the exterior of the building, toward the city lights. The hallway stretched. It elongated. The distance to the balcony seemed to double with every step I took. The walls on either side began to curve inward, bowing like a throat trying to swallow. I could hear the concrete man behind me, the heavy thud scrape of his body moving with terrifying speed. I saw a window opening. No glass, just a square of night sky. I threw myself at it. I didn't check the drop. I didn't check for a ledge. I just needed to be out of the concrete throat. I vaulted onto the balcony. It was a dead end, a sheer drop of 400 feet to the street below. I spun around. The concrete man was blocking the doorway. He filled the frame. He raised a hand, a jagged claw of rebar and cement. The graffiti on the balcony walls began to bleed. Thick black sludge oozed from the cracks in the masonry, forming a pool around my feet. It was sticky, like tar. It grabbed my boots. The building was digesting me. I climbed onto the parapet of the balcony. The wind hit me, violent and strong. I stood on the edge, teetering over the abyss. The concrete man stepped onto the balcony. He reached for me. I looked down. I saw the pool of the hotel swimming pool on the ground floor, a tiny blue rectangle in the darkness. I didn't jump. I climbed. I grabbed the rusted scaffolding pole attached to the side of the building. It was old, shaking in the wind. I swung myself over the edge, dangling over the city. The concrete man stopped at the parapet. He couldn't leave the structure. He was part of it. He leaned over the edge, watching me. I slid down the scaffolding. The metal tore my hands. Rust shards embedded themselves in my palms. I slid down 3 floors, swinging in the wind, until I reached a lower balcony that looked safe. I scrambled inside. This floor was different. It was quiet. The number on the wall said 36. I took the stairs. I ran down 36 flights of stairs, my legs screaming, my lungs burning. I didn't look at the walls. I didn't look at the graffiti. I burst out into the lobby, splashing through the stagnant water. I scrambled over the fence, tearing my shirt, and landed on the sidewalk of the street. The noise of the city hit me like a physical blow. The tuk-tuks, the chatter, the heat. Life. I lay on the pavement, gasping, staring up at the tower. It stood silent against the night sky, a black monolith. But high up, near the top, I saw a light. It wasn't a flashlight. It was a message. The graffiti on the top floor was glowing, a faint phosphorescent script that wrapped around the building's crown. We will wait. I left Bangkok the next day. I live in a flat, single-story house in Arizona now. No stairs, no elevators. But I have a problem with my walls. No matter how many times I paint them, cracks appear. Fine, hairline fractures in the plaster. And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I can hear writing. The sound of a sharp object scratching against the drywall. I don't look. I don't read it. I just turn up the TV and pray that the foundation holds. Because I know that buildings talk to each other, and the concrete throat in Bangkok has told them my name. History is usually written in ink, but in Laos, it is written in stone and gunpowder. The Sheng Kuang Plateau is a landscape of rolling green hills, scarred by millions of bomb craters from the Secret War. And scattered among these scars, standing like silent sentinels of a forgotten time, are the jars. Thousands of them. Megalithic stone urns, some as tall as a man, weighing up to 14 tons, carved from solid rock by a civilization that vanished without a whisper. My name is Nolan. I am a rogue archaeologist, the kind academia politely ignores because I ask the questions they are too afraid to answer. The official theory is that these jars were used for burial rituals or brewing wine. But you do not carve a 10-ton block of granite, drag it miles uphill, and seal it with a heavy stone lid just to store rice wine. You do it to contain something. You do it to keep something in. I had bypassed the tourist traps of Site 1 and Site 2. Using a map I had purchased from a demining unit, I trekked deep into the restricted zone, navigating a path between red warning markers that indicated unexploded ordnance. My destination was a valley that didn't appear on the UNESCO register, a place the locals called Thong Hai Hin Phi, the plain of the spirit jars. I arrived at dusk. The valley was a bowl of shadows, hemmed in by limestone karsts that looked like jagged teeth biting into the purple sky. In the center of the tall elephant grass stood the jars. There were hundreds of them. Unlike the weathered, broken vessels at the public sites, these were pristine. They were black, carved from a stone that absorbed the dying light. And most chilling of all, they were sealed. Heavy stone discs sat atop the rims, untouched by looters or time. I set up my camp on a ridge overlooking the site, careful to probe the ground for landmines before driving my tent pegs. The silence here was absolute. There were no birds, no crickets, just the sound of the wind moving through the tall grass, a dry, rustling whisper that sounded like thousands of dry fingers rubbing together. I ate a cold dinner, watching the moon rise. It was a harvest moon, fat and orange, casting a sickly glow over the black jars. As the temperature dropped, the valley began to sing. It wasn't a melody. It was a resonance, a low-frequency thrum that vibrated in the soles of my boots. It came from the jars. The stone was reacting to the cooling air, or perhaps to the moonlight. I grabbed my tools, a pry bar, a flashlight, and a camera, and descended into the field. I approached the largest jar in the center of the formation. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall. The surface was cold, but not rough. It was smooth, polished to a glass-like finish that felt unnatural under my gloved fingertips. I climbed up the side, finding purchase on the carved rim. I shone my light on the lid. It was sealed with a substance that looked like black resin. It hadn't cracked in 2,000 years. "What are you hiding?" I whispered. I wedged the pry bar under the lip of the lid. I applied pressure. The resin groaned. It was a sound like tearing cartilage. I put my weight into it. The seal gave way with a sharp popping sound that echoed like a gunshot in the silent valley. A hiss of escaping gas rushed out, a breath held for millennia released in a second. The smell hit me instantly. It wasn't the smell of wine. It wasn't the smell of dust or bones. It was the smell of preservation, formaldehyde, ozone, and something sweet and metallic, like copper dissolved in honey. I pushed the heavy stone lid. It slid across the rim with a grinding roar of stone on stone. I leaned over the opening and shone my light inside. It wasn't empty, and it wasn't full of bones. It was full of liquid. A thick, viscous, translucent gel filled the jar to the brim. It was perfectly clear, preserving the contents in suspended animation. Floating in the center of the gel was a figure. I recoiled, nearly falling off the jar. It wasn't human. It was humanoid, yes, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long, reaching down past the knees. The fingers were slender, multi-jointed and webbed. The head was elongated, bald and pale, but it was the face that froze my blood. It had no eyes, just smooth, pale skin where the sockets should be. And the mouth was sewn shut with gold wire. It looked peaceful. It looked like it was sleeping. I leaned closer, mesmerized. The creature was perfectly preserved. I could see the pores in its gray skin. I could see the faint blue veins pulsing slowly in its neck. Pulsing. I dropped my flashlight. It clattered against the side of the jar and fell into the tall grass, the beam spinning wildly before settling on the stone base. I didn't need the light to see what happened next. The moonlight was enough. The blue vein in the creature's neck pulsed again. The gel around it rippled. This wasn't a burial urn. It was a cocoon, a fermentation vat for a biology that history had forgotten. The creature's hand twitched. The long, webbed fingers flexed, testing the resistance of the gel. Then a sound came from inside the jar. It wasn't a scream. The mouth was sewn shut. It was a hum, a vibration that resonated through the fluid, through the stone, and into my chest. It was the same frequency as the valley song. I scrambled down from the jar, my boots slipping on the wet grass. I backed away, my eyes locked on the rim of the black vessel. The hum grew louder, and it was answered. From the darkness of the valley, other jars began to vibrate. The sound layered upon itself, building a dissonant chord that made my teeth ache. The ground beneath me began to shake. I looked at the jar I had opened. A hand reached out of the rim. It was wet, dripping with the thick, clear slime. It gripped the stone edge. The knuckles popped as it pulled. The head emerged. The eyeless face turned toward me. It couldn't see, but it could sense. It sensed the heat of my fear. It sensed the rhythm of my heart. The gold wire sewing its lips shut snapped. The sound of the wire breaking was tiny but distinct. The mouth opened. It was filled with needle-like teeth, arranged in concentric rows like a shark's. It inhaled, a long, rattling breath of the night air, and then it screamed. It was a sound that shouldn't exist in nature. A high-pitched, oscillating shriek that shattered the silence of the plateau. It sounded like metal tearing. The grass around the jar flattened as if hit by a shockwave. I covered my ears, falling to my knees. The pain was blinding. Then, the other lids began to move. All around the valley, the sound of grinding stone filled the air. Hundreds of jars were opening. Hundreds of lids were being pushed aside from within. They were waking up. I stood up and ran. I ran blindly into the night, away from the jars, away from the screaming. I forgot the map. I forgot the red markers. I sprinted through the tall grass, my breath tearing at my lungs. I felt the pressure plate depress under my boot before I heard the sound. I froze. A landmine. An American M14 toe popper. I was standing on it. If I lifted my foot, it would detonate. Behind me, I heard the sound of wet bodies hitting the ground. They were climbing out. They were coming. I could hear their breathing, hundreds of rattling inhalations. I could hear their footsteps, soft, heavy impacts on the earth. I had a choice. Stay and be taken by the things from the jars, or step off and be shattered by the bomb. I looked back. In the moonlight I saw them, a horde of pale, elongated figures moving through the grass on all fours. They were fast. They moved like spiders. The leader, the one I had released, was only 20 yards away. Its eyeless face was tilted up, sniffing the air. It smiled, revealing the rows of needles. It knew I was trapped. It stood up on its hind legs and walked toward me, unhurried. It reached out a long, slimy hand. I looked at the creature. I looked at the ground. I closed my eyes, and I stepped off. They say the plane of jars is a mystery. They say we don't know who built them, but that is a lie. We know. We just don't want to admit that we were not the first masters of this earth. I survived the blast. The mine was old. The charge was degraded. It took my leg, but it threw me clear of the valley. The villagers found me bleeding on the perimeter. They didn't go into the valley to check my story. They knew better. I wear a prosthetic now. I live in a quiet town in Ohio, but I still have the map. And sometimes I look at the satellite images of Site 52. The jars are empty now. All of them. And every time there is a missing person report in the news, every time someone vanishes without a trace in the woods, I wonder, did they wake up hungry? Pyongyang is a city of stagecraft. It is a metropolis of pastel-colored skyscrapers, wide boulevards, and smiling citizens that feels less like a capital city and more like a massive, open-air theater set. But looming over the synchronized spectacle is a flaw in the script. The Ryugyong Hotel, a 105-story pyramid of glass and concrete that pierces the skyline like a futuristic spear. For 30 years, it stood as a hollow shell, a hotel of doom that dominated the horizon but housed no guests. My name is Mason. I am an urban explorer, a specialist in infiltration. I had joined a state-sanctioned tour group to get into the country, playing the part of the naive tourist. But my goal was not the monuments to the great leaders. My goal was the Phantom Hotel. I had bribed a nervous government handler with 3 cartons of Marlboro Reds and a stack of US dollars to look the other way for 2 hours. He unlocked a service gate at the base of the construction site, his hands trembling. He refused to look at the tower. He simply pointed at his watch, signaling the deadline, and vanished into the shadows. I slipped inside. The exterior of the Ryugyong is clad in sleek blue glass, reflecting the city below. But the moment I stepped through the unfinished service entrance, the illusion shattered. The interior was a cavernous skeleton of raw, gray concrete. There was no marble lobby, no chandeliers, just a vast, dusty throat stretching up into the darkness. The air inside was dead. It was colder than the outside, smelling of pulverized stone, rust, and stagnant water. It was a silence so profound it felt like pressure building in my ears. I found the central stairwell. The elevators were non-functional, mere dark shafts dropping into the abyss. I began to climb. My boots kicked up clouds of concrete dust that hung in the still air like ghostly fog. I climbed for an hour. Floor 20, floor 30, floor 40. The layout was confusing. The building is a pyramid, so every floor is smaller than the one below it. The corridors narrowed as I ascended, angling inward. There were no railings on the staircases, just sheer drops down the central shaft that induced vertigo even in the dark. I reached the 65th floor. I decided to explore the corridor. It was a long, curving hallway of bare concrete chambers. No doors, just rectangular openings leading into empty rooms that looked out over the city. I walked to the edge of a room and looked out the glass. Pyongyang sparkled below, a grid of disciplined light. It looked peaceful. Then the sound started. It came from the ceiling of the room, a crackle of static. I spun around, shining my flashlight at the ceiling. Mounted in the corner, caked in decades of dust, was a speaker box. It was an old beige plastic unit, the kind used in schools in the 80s. Wires dangled from it, severed and frayed. It shouldn't have been working. There was no power in this shell, but the static continued, rhythmic and pulsing. Then, a voice cut through the noise. It was a woman's voice, high-pitched, overly enthusiastic, carrying the distinct marching cadence of North Korean news anchors. The sound was distorted, warped as if the tape was melting. It echoed through the empty concrete chamber, bouncing off the hard walls. I backed away. "Hello?" The voice didn't respond to me. It continued its broadcast. I left the room and went back to the corridor. The sound followed me. Every 10 feet, there was another speaker mounted on the wall. And now, they were all waking up. A chorus of distorted propaganda filled the hallway. Patriotic songs played at half speed, turning the triumphant brass melodies into a deep, moaning drone. I checked the wires on the nearest speaker. They were cut. The copper ends were corroded. There was absolutely no electrical connection. The building itself was broadcasting. The concrete had absorbed 30 years of radio waves, 30 years of loudspeakers blaring from the city below, and now it was sweating them back out. I needed to go higher. I needed to get away from the noise. I ran back to the stairs and climbed. 70, 80. The air grew thinner, the dust thicker. At the 85th floor, the stairs ended. A collapse had blocked the path upward. A pile of rubble and twisted rebar sealed the shaft. I was forced back into the corridors. I had to find another stairwell on the other side of the pyramid. I navigated the maze of rooms. The speakers here were louder, and the message had changed. It wasn't news anymore. It was a list. Names. Thousands of them. Read in a monotone voice. I realized with a jolt of nausea what this was. It wasn't a broadcast. It was a roll call. A census of the people who had built this place. Or perhaps the people who had died building it. I turned a corner and froze. At the end of the hallway, standing in front of a floor-to-ceiling window, was a silhouette. It looked like a construction worker. He was wearing a drab olive-green uniform and a hard hat. He was facing the window, looking out at the Juche Tower across the river. I turned off my flashlight. I crouched behind a concrete pillar. A guard? A squatter? The figure didn't move. He stood with rigid military posture. Then, the speaker above his head crackled. The figure turned. He didn't turn smoothly. He ratcheted around, his body jerking with the rhythm of the static. I saw his face in the moonlight filtering through the glass. It wasn't flesh. His skin was gray and pitted, with the same texture as the wall behind him. His eyes were empty sockets filled with dust. His mouth was a crack in the cement. He wasn't a man. He was a statue of concrete that had pulled itself out of the floor. He raised a stiff, heavy arm and pointed at the speaker. The volume increased. The sound became deafening. A wall of noise that made my teeth ache. More figures stepped out of the empty rooms. They were all the same. Gray, faceless, uniform. They filled the corridor, blocking my path to the other stairwell. They moved with the heavy, grinding sound of stone scraping against stone. They weren't attacking. They were organizing. They formed a line, standing shoulder to shoulder, blocking the hallway. A living wall of concrete. The speaker directly above me burst into life. I scrambled backward. I ran back toward the collapsed stairwell. The roll call of names grew faster. The music became a screeching cacophony. I reached the blocked stairs. I looked at the rubble. There was a small gap near the ceiling, a crawl space through the twisted rebar. I didn't hesitate. I threw my pack through and pulled myself up. The jagged metal tore my jacket and sliced my palms. I squeezed through the hole, scraping my chest, gasping in the dust-choked air. I tumbled out onto the landing of the 86th floor. It was silent here. No speakers, no concrete men. But the floor was different. It wasn't raw concrete. It was finished, carpeted in deep red velvet. The walls were paneled in dark mahogany. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, unlit but glimmering in the moonlight. I stood up confused. The exterior of the hotel was finished, but the interior was supposed to be a ruin. Yet here, 100 stories up, was a pristine, luxury hotel floor. I walked down the hallway. The doors were polished wood with gold numbers. Room 8601, room 8602. I heard a sound from room 8609. A television. I crept closer. The door was ajar. I pushed it open. The room was furnished in a style from the late 80s. Heavy drapes, floral patterns. In the center of the room, an old CRT television set was glowing. On the screen, a news anchor was reading a report. His mouth moved, but the sound didn't come from the TV. The sound came from the bed. Sitting on the edge of the bed was a figure wrapped in the bed sheets. It was shaped like a human, but beneath the sheets there was no body. It was just a shape held up by air. The voice emanated from the hollow space beneath the sheet. The sheet dropped. There was nothing underneath, just empty air. But the bed frame groaned as if a weight had shifted. The mattress depressed. Invisible footsteps walked across the carpet toward me. I turned and ran. I ran back to the hole in the rubble. I squeezed through, cutting my leg on the rebar. I dropped back down to the 85th floor. The concrete men were gone. The corridor was empty, but the speakers were screaming. A high-pitched feedback whine that threatened to burst my eardrums. I ran down the stairs. I didn't stop to count the floors. I slid down banisters that didn't exist. I jumped flights of steps. I ran until my legs were jelly. I ran until the gray concrete turned to the blue light of the lobby. I burst out of the service entrance into the cold night air of Pyongyang. My handler was waiting. He looked at his watch, then at me. He saw the blood on my hands, the dust coating my face. He didn't ask. He just shoved me into the back of a waiting van and drove. I left the country the next day. I deleted the photos, I burned my clothes, but I can't block out the signal. I live in London now, a noisy city. But sometimes, when there is a lull in the traffic, or when the radio is between stations, I hear it. I hear the static, and through the white noise, I hear a woman's enthusiastic voice reading a list. And last night, for the first time, I heard a new name on the list. They are waiting for me to check in. Beijing is not merely a city. It is a ghost story written in brick and stucco. Across a vast, arid plain of red earth, over 2,000 temples rise toward the sky. Some are massive, gilded mountains that glitter in the sun, maintained for the tourists. Others are crumbling skeletons, hidden by thorny acacia trees, forgotten by the mapmakers, slowly dissolving back into the dust from which they were raised. My name is Leo. I came to Myanmar seeking the perfect image, not the postcard shot of hot air balloons rising over the spires, but something raw, something empty. I wanted to capture the silence of the ancients. I rented an e-bike, a silent, battery-powered scooter, and set out at 4:00 a.m. The darkness was total. The only light came from the weak, yellow beam of my scooter cutting through the swirling dust of the dirt tracks. The air was cool, smelling of dry grass, old masonry, and the faint, sweet scent of incense burning in distant villages. I rode deep into the archaeological zone, far off the paved roads. I navigated sandy tracks that wove between the pagodas like a maze. I found a cluster of temples that looked promising. They were nameless structures, medium-sized, surrounded by a wall of overgrown brush and cacti. I parked the bike under a tamarind tree. The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the presence of history. 1,000,000 tons of brick pressing down on the earth. I climbed the narrow, hidden staircase of the largest temple in the cluster. The stairs were steep, claustrophobic tunnels built within the thick walls. I emerged onto the upper terrace just as the sky began to turn the color of a bruised plum. The mist was rising. In Beijing, the mist doesn't fall from the sky. It bleeds from the ground. It is a white ocean that swallows the base of the temples, leaving only the spires floating like islands in a sea of milk. I set up my tripod. I waited. As the light grew, I looked down into the courtyard of a smaller, roofless temple directly below me. The roof had collapsed centuries ago, exposing the inner sanctum to the elements. Inside, sitting amidst the rubble and weeds, was a Buddha statue. It was massive, perhaps 20 feet tall, made of brick and covered in peeling white plaster. It sat in the lotus position. Its eyes were half closed in meditation. Its right hand was touching the ground over its knee, the Bhumisparsha mudra, calling the earth to witness. I took a photo. The shutter click sounded absurdly loud in the quiet morning. The mist thickened. It rolled over the wall of the courtyard below, obscuring the base of the statue. Then it rose higher, swallowing the torso, until only the serene white face remained visible, floating in the gray vapor. I turned away to change my lens, swapping the wide angle for a telephoto. It took me perhaps 30 seconds. I was fumbling with the lens cap in the dim light. When I looked back down, the face was gone. The mist had risen, yes, but the head should still have been visible. I peered through the telephoto lens, searching for the white plaster against the gray fog. Nothing. Just gray swirls. I lowered the camera. Maybe the mist was thicker than I thought, or maybe the light was playing tricks on me. I decided to go down. The view from the ground might be more atmospheric, I reasoned. I navigated the dark stairs, feeling the rough brick scrape against my shoulders. I emerged at the base of the temple. The visibility was now less than 10 feet. The world had shrunk to a small gray circle around me. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind. I walked toward the courtyard where I had seen the statue. I wanted to see the texture of the peeling plaster up close. I stepped through the arched gateway. The grass was wet with dew. The courtyard was empty. I stopped. I blinked, wiping the moisture from my eyelashes. I walked to the center of the space. There was a pedestal. There were fragments of brick, but the 20-foot statue I had seen from above was not there. I felt a cold prickle of confusion at the base of my spine. I must have entered the wrong courtyard. The temples here were symmetrical, confusing. I must have turned left instead of right. I backtracked. I walked out of the archway and circled the temple. The red brick walls loomed out of the fog, indistinguishable from one another. I found another entrance. I walked in. This courtyard was also empty, but in the corner, standing in the shadows of a Bodhi tree, was a statue. It was not sitting. It was standing. A tall, slender figure with elongated arms hanging by its sides. The plaster was gray with mold. Its face was eroded, the features melted by centuries of rain into a smooth, blank mask. I hadn't seen a standing statue from the roof. I backed away. "Just get to the bike," I whispered. "Go back to the road." I walked back to the tamarind tree where I had parked the e-bike. It wasn't there. I checked the ground. My footprints were there in the sand, leading to this spot. The tire tracks were visible, but the bike was gone. Panic began to set in. A quiet, gnawing panic. The mist was distorting sound. I couldn't hear the distant highway. I couldn't hear the wind chimes that usually adorn the temple spires. I started walking in a straight line, hoping to hit a main track. After 5 minutes of stumbling through the brush, a shape loomed in the fog. A temple. I recognized the archway. It was the first one I had entered, the one that was supposed to contain the sitting Buddha. I had walked in a circle. I stepped inside, desperate for a landmark. The sitting Buddha was there. It hadn't moved. It was exactly where it should have been. The massive, peeling white figure, sitting in the lotus position in the center of the ruins. I let out a breath, a laugh of relief bubbling in my throat. I had just been lost, disoriented by the fog. The statue hadn't moved. I was just tired. I walked closer, admiring the scale of it. Then I stopped. The hand. When I photographed it from the roof, the right hand was touching the ground. The Earth Witness Mudra, fingers pointing down. Now the right hand was raised. The palm was facing outward, fingers vertical, the Abhaya Mudra, the gesture of fearlessness, or the gesture to stop. I stared at the hand. The plaster at the wrist was cracked, revealing the red brick beneath. It didn't look like it had moved recently. It looked ancient, frozen. The cracks were filled with dust, but I knew what I had seen. I lifted my camera. I pressed the playback button to look at the photo I had taken from the roof. The screen flickered. The image appeared. It showed the mist. It showed the courtyard, but the center of the image, where the statue should have been, was blurred. Not a focus blur, a motion blur, as if the subject had moved faster than the shutter speed. I looked up at the statue's face. The eyes were no longer half closed. They were wide open. They were not painted eyes. They were holes. Deep, dark tunnels drilled into the plaster, staring directly at where I was standing. The mist swirled around the statue, momentarily obscuring it. I heard a sound. It was the sound of heavy dust falling, as if something massive had shifted its weight in the dirt. I didn't wait for the mist to clear. I turned and ran. I ran out of the courtyard, blindly into the fog. I ran until my lungs burned. Every time I passed a temple, I saw them. Figures in the alcoves, figures in the doorways. They were never moving when I looked at them. They were always frozen, statues of brick and plaster. But their positions were wrong. I passed a reclining Buddha, a massive figure lying on its side. I glanced back over my shoulder a second later. It was pushing itself up on one elbow. I passed a row of disciples, 10 stone monks standing in a line. When I approached, they were facing forward. When I looked back, 10 stone heads were turned to the left, tracking my movement. The landscape was a chessboard, and the pieces were moving every time the white curtain of mist fell. I tripped over a root and fell hard into the red dust. I scrambled up, spitting grit. Ahead of me, the mist thinned slightly. I saw a paved road. I saw a tour bus driving slowly, its headlights cutting the gloom. I sprinted toward it, waving my arms. "Stop, please." The bus didn't stop. It was empty, a ghost bus for the early shift. But I followed the road. I walked for 3 miles, keeping to the center of the asphalt, refusing to look at the temples lining the road. I reached the town of Nyong'u. I paid the rental shop for the stolen bike. I packed my bags. I took the first flight out to Yangon. I am safe now. I am in a city with crowds and noise, but I have a recurring dream. I dream of the mist. And in the dream, I am back in the courtyard. I am standing in front of the white statue. Its hand is no longer raised in the stop gesture. Its hand is reaching out, palm up, fingers beckoning. And its lips, those eroded plaster lips, are curving into a smile, cracks forming in the dry masonry as the mouth widens. The guidebooks say Bagan is a place of peace, a place of spiritual reflection. But I know the truth. The statues are not guarding the temples. They are the prisoners of the temples, and they are desperate for someone to take their place. Beijing is a city of circles. 7 ring roads radiate outward from a single silent center. That center is the Forbidden City. For 500 years, this sprawling complex of red walls and golden tiles was the axis of the known world, the home of the Son of Heaven. But it was also a gilded cage, a prison for thousands of women, concubines, servants, and eunuchs who lived and died at the whim of the emperor. My name is Adrian. I am a photographer specializing in night architecture. I had spent months navigating the bureaucracy of the Palace Museum to obtain a special permit. My goal was to photograph the unopened zones, the dilapidated sections of the inner court that have remained untouched since the last emperor was evicted in 1924. The tourists left at 5 o'clock. The massive wooden gates swung shut, pushing the chaos of modern Beijing out, leaving me alone inside the 72-hectare complex. The transformation was instant. The noise of the city vanished, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like the air had solidified. I was accompanied by a security guard, a young man named Mr. Chen. He was nervous. He told me in hushed tones that we must stick to the main paths. He said the hutongs, the narrow alleyways between the high red walls, were treacherous at night. He claimed the geometry of the palace changed when the sun went down. I ignored him. While he was distracted lighting a cigarette near the gate of heavenly purity, I slipped away. I wanted the palace of eternal spring. I wanted the shadows. I navigated the labyrinth of the western palaces. The architecture here was different from the grand ceremonial halls. It was intimate, claustrophobic. The walls were high, painted a deep ox-blood red that looked black in the moonlight. The corridors were narrow, designed to limit the view, to keep secrets contained. I found a side gate that was slightly ajar. It led into a courtyard that was clearly off limits. Weeds grew through the cracks in the paving stones. The paint on the wooden pillars was peeling, hanging in strips like dead skin. The windows of the pavilion were covered in paper that had rotted away, leaving dark, gaping holes that stared out like empty eye sockets. I set up my tripod. The moon was high, casting sharp, elongated shadows across the courtyard. The silence was absolute. No wind, no insects. Then I heard the water. It was a faint, rhythmic sound. There were no fountains in this part of the palace. The water features were all in the Imperial Garden, half a mile away. I followed the sound. It led me to the corner of the courtyard, tucked away behind a screen of dead bamboo. There, set into the stone floor, was a well. It was small, the mouth barely wide enough for a person's shoulders. The stone rim was worn smooth, polished by centuries of use. A heavy stone slab, meant to cover the opening, had been pushed aside. The sound was coming from inside. I approached the well, my boots crunching softly on the dead bamboo leaves. The splashing stopped as I got close. I leaned over the rim and shone my flashlight down. The beam cut through the darkness. The shaft was deep, lined with green, slime-slicked bricks. At the bottom, perhaps 30 feet down, was the water. It was black, stagnant, and perfectly still. I stared at the water. My reflection stared back, small and distorted. Then, the reflection changed. My face in the water rippled. It wasn't the water moving. It was the reflection itself. The face in the well dissolved and reformed into something else. A woman's face, pale, bloated. Her hair was floating around her like a halo of black seaweed. I jerked back, gasping. I shone the light down again. Nothing. Just black water. Tricks of the light, I whispered. Just pareidolia. I turned to leave. I wanted to get back to the main path, back to Mr. Chen. The atmosphere in this courtyard was hostile. I felt unwanted. I walked back toward the gate I had entered. It was closed. I pushed against the wood. It held fast. It wasn't locked. It felt fused, as if the wood had grown into the frame. I turned around to look for another exit. The courtyard had changed. When I entered, it was a square space with a single pavilion. Now, it looked longer. The walls seemed to have stretched. And at the far end of the courtyard, standing in front of the peeling pavilion doors, was a figure. It was a woman. She was wearing the traditional dress of the Qing dynasty court, a kipao of embroidered silk, though the colors were faded to gray in the moonlight. On her feet, she wore the distinctive flower pot platform shoes with a central wooden pedestal that required a delicate balancing gait. Her hair was piled high in an elaborate headdress, adorned with ornaments that glinted dully. She was facing away from me. "Hello?" I called out. "I'm locked in. Can you help me?" The figure didn't turn. She began to walk. She moved with a strange, stiff fluidity. The wooden heels of her shoes struck the paving stones with a sharp, rhythmic sound. Clack, 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 clack. She walked toward the well. I watched her, a cold dread pooling in my stomach. "Miss?" She reached the well and stopped. She stood perfectly still, looking down into the dark opening. Then, she began to weep. It wasn't a theatrical sob. It was a wet, gurgling sound. The sound of lungs trying to inhale water. It echoed off the high red walls, filling the courtyard with a suffocating sorrow. Slowly, painfully, she began to turn toward me. The movement was rigid, like a marionette being twisted by its strings. She turned her shoulders, then her neck. She faced me. I dropped my camera. The lens shattered on the stone floor. She had no face. Where her eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was nothing but smooth, pale skin, like a porcelain doll that had never been painted. No features, no expression, just a blank, white oval. Yet, I knew she was looking at me. I could feel the intensity of her gaze burning into me, and I could still hear the weeping. It was coming from the smooth skin where her mouth should be, a muffled, underwater sobbing vibrating through the flesh. She raised a hand. Her fingernails were long, protected by gold guards that curved like talons. She pointed at the well. Then, she started to move toward me. The sound was faster now. She wasn't walking. She was gliding, the wooden shoes striking the stone in a rapid staccato. I ran. I ran to the side of the courtyard, looking for a window, a gap in the wall, anything. The red walls loomed over me, impossibly high. They seemed to be leaning in, closing the top of the courtyard like a lid. I ran down a narrow alleyway between two buildings. It was a dead end. I turned back. The faceless woman was standing at the entrance of the alley, blocking the way. She tilted her blank head to the side. The weeping stopped. A new sound began. It was the sound of water rushing, a roar of liquid filling a confined space. I looked down. Water was seeping up through the cracks in the paving stones. Dark, foul-smelling water. It rose rapidly, covering my boots, my ankles. It was freezing cold. The woman took a step forward. The water rose to my knees. It swirled around me, pulling at my legs with an unseen current. I scrambled up a pile of discarded roof tiles, trying to get to high ground. She was close now. I could smell her. She didn't smell of perfume or silk. She smelled of stagnant well water and wet rot. She reached out with her gold-taloned hand. She didn't strike me. She touched my cheek. Her skin was ice-cold and wet. A voice resonated in my head. It wasn't spoken. It was pushed into my mind. A voice that bubbled and drowned. The water surged. It rose over my head in a massive, impossible wave. I didn't hold my breath. I screamed. The dirty water filled my mouth, my nose, my lungs. It tasted of mud and sorrow. I thrashed in the darkness, feeling the heavy silk of her dress wrapping around me, pulling me down into the narrow stone shaft. I blacked out. I woke up on the stone floor of the courtyard. It was morning. The sun was shining. Mr. Chen was shaking my shoulder, his face pale with fear. "Mr. Adrian, we have been looking for you all night. Where did you go?" I sat up, coughing violently. Water, dark, foul water, spilled from my lips. I heaved, expelling pints of the fluid onto the dry paving stones. Mr. Chen stepped back, horrified. "The well of the Pearl Concubine," he whispered, looking at the corner of the courtyard. "You were sleeping next to it." I looked at the well. The heavy stone slab was back in place. It looked undisturbed. I looked at my camera. It was lying on the ground where I had dropped it. The lens was shattered, but the camera body was soaking wet, dripping with slime. I stood up, my legs shaking. "Let's go," I rasped. "Get me out of here." We walked back through the palace. The tourists were arriving, filling the space with noise and color, but I couldn't hear them. All I could hear was the sound of water. I flew back to America 2 days later. I went to doctors. They pumped my stomach. They treated me for pneumonia. They told me I had nearly drowned. But they can't explain the water. It doesn't go away. When I sleep, I wake up choking. My sheets soaked in cold, stagnant fluid. My house smells of the well. And when I look in the mirror, I can see it happening. My features are fading. My nose is less defined. My lips are blurring into my skin. My eyes are sinking deeper into the flesh. I am becoming blank. I am becoming like her. The Forbidden City is not just a place. It is a collection. And it has decided that I belong in the collection. I know that soon, my mouth will seal shut. And then I will only be able to weep from the inside.